Iridumarang, Yuandu Anita Heiss, Baladu Wiradjuri Geelang, Arambajibu, Brunglibu, Megandi, Bala Williams, Yindamatagul, Wurundjeri Gul, Mangul, and Mundangul to Uncle Perry for that welcome to country. Hello everyone, my name's Anita Heiss. I have Wiradjuri belonging from Arambi Mission and Brungle Mission in central New South Wales. I'm a Williams and I pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne, and I say Mundangu is thank you, so I want to say Mundangu to Shane and all his team, the beautiful team they met this morning, and everyone here at the City of Melbourne for the invitation to speak. I acknowledge our elders as leaders who continue to pave the way for people like me to have a voice. Many of them, when they were young, didn't have a voice. And I want to acknowledge the original storytellers of this country as well, because we've been passing on stories since the beginning of time. And I want to thank everybody who came out in this Melbourne weather, because I live in Brisbane and at 12 degrees nobody would go outside at all. So I'm so impressed, so impressed. I'd like to acknowledge all the VIPs in the room. By that I mean the very Indigenous peoples. Obviously the Mayor, Sally Capp, who I'm told from people on the ground is a fantastic supporter for mob locally, and that's always a good thing to hear. Also the councillor. Now, Nick Francis Gilly, I'm not quite sure if I call you Nick or Nick Francis or Francis Gilly or Councillor. Nick would be polite, okay, to Councillor Nick and Councillor Kathy Oak. Thank you for being with us today as well. So I'm speaking to you today as a sovereign Wiradjuri woman who never ceded my sovereignty. I'm a Wiradjuri citizen with the rights and responsibilities to help build the Wiradjuri nation, and with a burning desire today to help rebuild Australia through the process of reconciliation, this year using truth-telling, or every year we hope, using truth-telling and courage as guiding principles. I need to say I can't see many of you. So I have about a dozen pairs of glasses and I left them all in Sydney, and I've had 6 people loan me pairs and I can't see anything. So, but if you're taking photos, I prefer to have glasses on, so let me know. Okay. So, the theme of this year, as we know, is grounded in truth and walk together with courage. So the first thing I thought about when I was writing my paper for today was I needed to begin with my own truth about reconciliation, about the movement, the process, and my role within that. So I want to preface my confession to you today. It's been a long time since I've been to confession. Bless me, for I have sinned. I want to say I'm actually really thrilled to be here today, sharing in the City of Melbourne event. I happily spoke this week to Air Services Australia at Brisbane Airport. It was a really interesting experience, and they have a very proactive diversity team nationally, so I was really pleased to be there, and they're doing great things. And I also was I work at University of Queensland part-time, and I was part of a great book swap for the Indigenous Literacy Foundation there. I firmly believe that National Reconciliation Week, with a focused theme each year, provides individuals, communities, organisations and corporations with the opportunity to come together specifically to engage on the big issues on a journey that we have all chosen to share. I know that reconciliation action plans, when they are treated as policy documents, and I like to call them policy documents because if you call it policy, then there's a greater urgency to actually follow policy. And they're public. You've made a commitment to the public that you will have these outcomes. So I think they serve as a great structure for accountability and outcomes. And it's through that structure and that structural process that I understand that the City of Melbourne has a very proud history of reconciliation, being one of 8 RAP trailblazers. And I understand the City of Melbourne is transitioning into their 5th RAP, which is Elevate, stretching the stretch RAP. And Shane is happy to talk to you over coffee about the outcomes for that. Now to my confession. Now, I was an official supporter of National Reconciliation Week back in 2014, but my truth is that I've not always been a fan nor an advocate for the reconciliation process. When the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, or CAR as it was known, was set up back in 1991, I was 22 years of age, and I had a very, very simplistic view of what I understood the process to be. I thought it was quite bizarre to have a government-created agency designed to teach white people to simply respect and acknowledge and be kind to blackfellas. So it was very simple. I was also annoyed. I was very annoyed back then because as an Aboriginal person, I was expected to participate in this process because it was for Aboriginal people, because it was the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation, while non-Aboriginal people could easily choose whether they participated or not, which is still relevant today. Now, it was because of my feelings back then that I kept my distance from anything reconciliation related until 1997 when I was living on the Gold Coast. And Jackie Huggins, who was a friend of mine, she was a member of CAR back then, and she asked me to attend a women's reconciliation dinner in Brisbane. Now, I went because Jackie was my friend, and really that was the only reason. But I'm really glad I went because it is there that I had my epiphany. Now, in that space, in Vulture Street, West End, on a Friday night, I think it was a Friday night, the space legally held 250 people, and the organisers squeezed in 400 women, right? So I was confronted by the reality that there was a whole grassroots movement of Australians, and in this case women, wanting to be part of a process that allowed us all to be dignified and respected and to live together peacefully. Now, at one stage at dinner, the MC asked all the non-Indigenous people in the room to stand up, all the women, and recite a pledge that would bring other non-Aboriginal people into the process. And I stood up on my chair and I took a photo, and it really shook me and my understanding of what was possible and what was already happening. And I mean, that was 22 years ago though, and I did think about making all the non-Indigenous people stand up today, but I've changed my idea there. So I thought there was quite an extraordinary moment. So too was the moment when the MC suggested that, ladies, if you haven't had the chance to hug an Aboriginal woman, perhaps you could do that tonight. Don't. That's not part of the process. Okay. We are not some kind of novelty. Okay. Don't be friending me on Facebook after this either. No, I'm kidding. Now, in preparing for this talk, look, laughter. You would think that blackfellas never laughed. Humour is what has sustained us over 200 odd years of living, with adversity. We have to be able to laugh. So in preparing for this talk, I was reminded of my own personal journey as an advocate, but once reluctant recruit to the process. And I dug out some poems that I'd written back in the 1990s around the time of attending that event in Brisbane. And I just was going to share one. It's called Reconciliation Number 1. And I'm not really a poet. When I go to schools, I'm sure English teachers are horrified because the kids will say, what's the difference between poetry and prose? And I say, well, if it looks like that, it's a poem, and if it goes to the end of the line, it's prose. But I know there's probably some really deadly poets in the room, so mine's not poetry, it's just not prose. All right. So you want to be my friend, make peace with me now after all this time, but you show no remorse for the wrongs done, seeing compensation as your penance rather than my right. You want to reconcile, but will never admit that we were at war. The greatest undeclared war in history. And you want me to forget now, but will you forget your own sufferings? Will you stop marching on Anzac Day? Will you stop saying the ode in RSL clubs? Of course not. Then why should we forget the battles, the deaths, and the continued dying? Why should we forget the raping of our women, our land, and our culture? Why should we say we forgive when you can't even say you're sorry? Keep your reconciliation budget if you can't see in your heart that the present is a continuum of the past and the future looks no better. Reconciliation is only for some, and many of them were already on our side. Now, I wrote that 21 years ago. Unfortunately, some of it remains relevant today, but of course some of it doesn't. Obviously, we've had a national apology and we acknowledge Sorry Day annually. Since my epiphany, in Brisbane back in the day. I've spoken at many reconciliation gatherings and I've witnessed the success and the sustainability of the Residents for Reconciliation movement. Now, I understand there's about 23 local groups in New South Wales that are still active, and they've been going for a very long time. I had a quick look on Facebook the other day, and the Hornsby Residents for Reconciliation group are hosting their own mongrel match this Sunday, and they've got an event today with students. And so I think with that in mind, the longevity of and ongoing activity of locally run groups, the reconciliation movement is possibly one of the most successful grassroots movements this country has seen in terms of stamina and determination. Of course, it hasn't been successful in the fact that we're still having to do this, and hopefully, in the next generation, the children and grandchildren won't have to be having these conversations. But we've come from a space where my mother couldn't even have the conversation. So we have to hope. I'm a glass half full person, and I say to people, if we didn't believe that we can make change, I wouldn't get out of bed. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, post the election a couple of weeks ago. This movement has outlasted the Labor and Liberal governments and will no doubt outlive the current government. And I believe this because there are many, like those of us in this room, who understand the importance of what we are doing and why we are doing it. Our rights have already been recognised by the UN and the Convention of Indigenous Peoples. We just need the rest of Australia and our government to understand and adhere to those rights. Truth in history and truth in the present. Can you? My left side's best, honestly. No, I don't mind taking photos, but from that side. And we talked about up high, one chin. Yeah. You got the brief. All right. No, so truth. So my first book came out in 1996. It's called Sacred Cows, and it was born out of an experience that I had about lives and untruths about Aboriginal people when I was at the University of New South Wales, doing my honours degree on the 1967 referendum. And I had to do a seminar paper on a book uniquely titled Australian Aborigines. But it was written by someone who'd never been to Australia. So I say to girls in classrooms, can you imagine if you had to go to the library today and you were going to write an essay on the feminist movement, and every single book in the library was written by a man? Would we think that was not only unusual but outrageous? And yes. So I go and get the book off the shelf, penned by somebody. It was based on letters written by someone in New South Wales in the new colony, and they'd write, today we did this with the natives, and today we did that with the natives, and you'd send the letter off to this fella in Britain who ended up publishing the book. So one day, 5 Aboriginal men take this fella hunting. And they go out bush and they leave him for a short period of time, and only 4 come back. So he assumes they ate the 5th one. As you do. So you go out from if I said let's go have afternoon tea and somebody didn't come back, I'm not going to assume they ate the other half. There's a few sandwiches out there. And we laugh because it's insane. That logic is insane. But what I tell writing students is when we die, we take our opinions with us. But the written word lasts forever. So he writes a letter back to Britain, says the natives are cannibals because 5 went away, 4 came back, obviously they ate the 5th one. He sends it off to Britain. I get it in a book 100 years later from the University of New South Wales Library. Now, until that moment in time, I had never heard anything about Aboriginal people being cannibals. And I didn't hear anything again until Pauline Hanson appeared, and that's another oration altogether. And so I realised 2 things at that moment in time. The first thing is that the recording of history is completely subjective. And the way in which the colonisers remember and record history is significantly different to the way in which the colonised remember and record history the world over. And most of our history books have been recorded by colonisers. And so then, if we came back here tomorrow and I asked you to record the history of today, I guarantee you every single person in this room would record it differently, including myself. There are facts that you could not change. We are in the Swanston room, is it? Councillor doesn't even know. We're in the Swanston room. We're in the Swanston room, Councillor. It's Friday. It's dreary weather in Melbourne. Okay, that's subjective. It's 14 degrees, it's rainy, and we're in Swanston Street in the town hall. Facts. I'm fabulous. Facts you can't change. No, you're all hearing the same thing. But I guarantee you, all of you would record it differently. Some would recall it chronologically, some emotionally, some will focus on a particular point in time, and that's all okay. We all just need to be conscious of when we read, we're reading through the lens of the author. And so my students say, oh, you're saying we can't read books by white people about black people. I say, I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying be conscious of the lens they're writing through. But if I want to learn about farming, I'm going to buy a book by a farmer, not a stockbroker. So that the subjectivity, that's what I realised. Another thing was that I needed to write something as you know, the first person in my family to go to university and so forth. I wrote Sacred Cows. It was a send-up of Australian culture because I thought we are bicultural. We are employed, socialised, educated through non-Indigenous systems and so forth, but we're always under the microscope of being measured against Eurocentric values and so forth. So I thought I'm going to look at what white culture looks like. Skippy, the backyard barbecue, throw another shrimp on the barbie. Who remembers that ad? Throw another shrimp on the barbie. Paul Hogan makes an ad for American television. You know what's fascinating about that? So that's 95, 4, 5. Aussies never threw shrimp on the barbie before then. Aussies ate prawns, fresh, or back in those days, covered in honey and sesame seeds at the local Chinese restaurant. And all of a sudden, Aussies are throwing shrimp on the barbie because Paul Hogan makes an advert for Americans to lure them to our shores. They have barbecues and prawns. And I just thought, you know, it's easy to pick apart somebody else's culture. So I didn't know back then that I was going to write, I think, 18 books now. The first novel, excuse me, 2 seconds. Can I just, is this being live streamed? So no swearing, okay. Hello everybody on Facebook, you should be working. Bet you're all public servants. Or artists, I'm joking. Okay, so, no. Hello out there in Facebook land. If I do drop any profanities, I will say that's colonisers' language. We didn't have profanities. And people say to me, oh, yes, you did. I said, well, Wiradjuri, we would call someone a miri, but that's just a dog. That's not that bad. I mean, it's not nice, but okay. The first novel I ever wrote was 18 years ago. So when I wrote that 2 days ago, I was like, oh, I'm getting so old. It's about a young girl who was stolen from her family in New South Wales and placed into Bomaderry Aboriginal Children's Home before she went to Cootamundra Aboriginal Girls' Home, where my grandmother was. Now, Mary Talents is a fictional character, but she encompasses all the stories of so many children like her, who suffered from racist government policy that disconnected our people from family, from community, from country, from culture, and significantly from identity. It was the policy of cultural genocide. And I was asked to write a story about a stolen child so that Australian school students could come to understand through a diary format what life was like for an Aboriginal child at that time living under the Act of Protection. This book came out in 2001 and we were teaching in New South Wales about stolen generations from before then. So let's say around 2000. Now, to my great despair, disbelief and disgust, last year I spoke during Reconciliation Week at the State Library of Queensland. A teacher in the audience came up later on, had a chat to me, and she's a teacher on the Gold Coast, and she said, you know, we still don't teach the stolen generations. 2018. 2018. And this is why I'm an advocate for a national curriculum. Because what we have in this example on the Gold Coast is 2 levels of denial. By not teaching the history of the policies of removal that are still impacting people, our people today, or by picking and choosing what aspects of Australian history you want to teach, you are denying that that happened. And at the same time, you are denying Australian students their right to learn a complete history. Now, it's partly because of this denial of truth of Australian history and where we fit in or where we don't fit in, where we are underrepresented or misrepresented or not represented at all, that inspires me to write us into the Australian literary landscape, into the Australian narrative, to write us into history books, because our truths are also your truths. Everything post 1770 and the flag going down at Possession Point is Australian history. We didn't massacre ourselves. You often hear about that's Aboriginal history. We didn't write the policies of removal and protection and assimilation. That's it's your history, but it's shared history. In September 2014, I was in Pearl Harbor for the third time, and I'd noticed the number of Japanese tourists there before, but it was the first time I really observed that the bulk of tourists at Pearl Harbor are Japanese. And I wondered what they must be thinking, watching. Has anybody been to Pearl Harbor? Yeah, this very intense moment, experience, and you watch a film that obviously is a very American version of their shared history. And it made me think about World War II, when we've been talking about the war today, and Uncle and his family. And it made me think about World War II, and particularly Cowra. My mother was on a Rambi mission during the Cowra breakout. Have people heard about the Cowra breakout? So on the 5th of August 1944, early hours in the morning, 1,200 Japanese soldiers attempted to break out of Compound B, where they were housed. And I thought, nothing I'd ever read or seen about the Cowra breakout mentioned that Wiradjuri men went to war, went to both wars from that town. Some didn't come home. And that 4.5 miles in a direct line from the POW camp was a Rambi mission. Whereas another camp where Wiradjuri people, and my mother and the Williams mob in Hut 16 lived under the Act of Protection on rations. It was a segregated town. The cinema was segregated. Blackfellas entered through a side door. The hospital was segregated, with linen had the letters ABO written on it, so it wasn't used with white people. Now, at the prisoner of war camp, so there were 4 compounds, A, B, C and D. There's Italians, Japanese, Indonesians. They had a military hospital. We treated POWs to the letter of the law under the Genevan Convention, as we should have. And my point is, we treated POWs better than we treated our mob, right? Italians could go out and work in community, and they were more employable than the local Koris. Yeah? Japanese soldiers were fed rice and fish and got healthy, and they had their own military hospital. And so I wanted to write the stories of our men, particularly, and our life under the Act during wartime in a way that it's never been shared before. And when Uncle talked about his family that went to war, I was sitting there going, where are their stories? Where are our stories in the military history of this country at a time where people came back home and were treated like dirt again? Yeah? So I wrote Barbed Wire and Cherry Blossoms. And it's interesting, I went to Hiroshima as part of the research, and it's about how we frame shared history. Pearl Harbor's a war memorial, Hiroshima's a peace memorial. And you can walk through there for 10, 15 minutes and not even realise who dropped the bomb, because it's not about blame. It's about this happened, let's not let it happen again. It's extraordinary the way in which we can share a moment in time and tell the same story differently. Yeah? Our stories are our survival, as Lawrence Bamblett, he's from Cowra, from Rambi as well. It's his PhD, and there's lots of stories in there, and how recording history through storytelling is also our survival. So I learned a lot through reading his work as well. Last year we released Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia, where we had 120 submissions from around the country. Can't see really in the audience, so I don't know if any of the local Melbourne people are here, but there will be names that you can recognise, obviously, from up there. People, we published 52. We've got submissions or stories from remote, rural, urban, desert and seaboard communities, from Nukunu to Noongar, Wiradjuri to Western Aranda, Kukulyalanji to Kunabiji, Gunditjmara to Gumbaynggirr, and everywhere in between. Over 50% of the contributions are women. I didn't know that until a reviewer pointed it out, so I wasn't looking to fit any, gender gap or even country. I just wanted as many stories as I could get in there as possible. There are recollections of growing up Aboriginal in Australia by educators, artists, journalists, sports people, academics and activists, and others obviously. And in many ways the anthology also serves to demonstrate how we contribute to and participate in many and varied aspects of society every day. The youngest contributor was 15, And I read her story and I was filled with hope. You know, the passion of youth that we all had when we were young. And we were, going to change the world, and then you get old and you're tired. And then she was 13, sorry, I've since met her, and she's 15 now, in west of Sydney. The oldest was Auntie Norleen Brinkworth from Yarrabah, and she sent in so much material. She's got a book in her for sure. We had a student who was in Year 12 in South Australia, Frank Zakelli. He was in Port Augusta, and we had a brother incarcerated in Adelaide, and someone outside, a writer outside, helped to get his story involved. Now, every contributor told their own raw truths about their experience of growing up Aboriginal in Australia. The focus, of course, was on Aboriginality, but a common theme was the preoccupation that non-Indigenous Australians have with how we look and the challenges to identity that our people face every single day. Like, it's your right, and I don't mean you, but something like that, it's your right to ask me how I'm black and to prove that. And it's quite disturbing. Racism in the education system, just more like, I was reading stories going, yep, understand that. And then there were moments I was going, oh my God, like still, racism in the education system, obviously the impact of stolen generations and resilience. So it's a challenging read for non-Indigenous people. I've had people message me who've given whole sets to their senior management teams in major corporations. So you need to read this as a starting. And people are challenged. You know, I've got friends who went to their first funeral in their 30s. And, you know, we go to funerals when we're kids. We are now burying our children because we have a crisis in youth suicide. And there's a strong theme of suicide. So it's a challenging read. Having said that, it's full of warmth and hope and generosity of spirit and courage. So yes, it's challenging, but I do recommend you read it. And sometimes I've had people review, for instance, my memoir, Am I Black Enough for You? And they'll write, this is the book you give that racist uncle, right? So if you've got someone you think could benefit and you can afford to buy it or get it from the library and loan it to them, do that. Right, now I know that's blurry. That is how I prefer to view it. I woke up at 8:30am on Sunday, May 19, feeling depleted of energy, disillusioned about the country we live in, and depressed about the outcome of the federal election. I had cried a lot the night before, and I'd been awake on and off since 3am, drafting and redrafting my Facebook post, trying to understand the election result and wondering who in my world had possibly voted in this bigoted government. A government that had time and time again made it perfectly clear that Indigenous Australia was not a priority, that our voices were of no importance, and that they had no respect for any consultation process that we had employed to provide them with a blueprint for a better future via the Uluru Statement from the Heart. On most days of the year, I'm a really early riser. I'm awake before 6 and I run, or I go to the gym, or I write. I'm saying that in case my publisher's watching. I write. Emails. I could not get out of bed. That's not me. Like, I never stay in bed. I could not get out of bed. I was like texting people back and forth. Everyone's like lots of profanities, tears. I was so depressed and in a state of disbelief and concern about living in a society that values money and self over land and community. I said my piece on social media and then deleted those who kept referring to the fact that we can agree to differ. We are all entitled to our opinion. And it's okay to feel sad if your team didn't win. Politics is not sport. Legislation to protect the planet is not a game. Choosing a government is not barracking for a team. And of course, I know we can agree to differ on our opinions, but my politics are not based on my opinions. My politics are based on my values, and my values come from tens of thousands of years of a Wiradjuri mob living together respectfully. I've been learning my language with Uncle Stan Grant and Letitia Harris and Yari since last year, and Lloyd Dolan in Wagga. It's a really hard language to learn, and I'm a slow learner. You have to forget everything you learned in English because it's a completely different grammar system. I mean, we're lucky we've got loads of resources. It's a grammar book. I don't think I learned English properly at school, to be honest with you. We're also looking at Wiradjuri nation building and talking about what an ideal Wiradjuri nation would look like, at least within the confines of the discussion of our classroom, we talk about exercising our sovereignty and creating a lifestyle that supports everyone. And we talk about inclusivity. It's not just for Wiradjuri people. We have multiple relationships with non-Wiradjuri people. It's not about us and them. It's about our rights to exercising sovereignty in a nation that supports everybody, particularly the most vulnerable. But we all live together. Everything we talk about is for the nourishment and future of the whole community, the whole nation, and all that encompasses. Following the... You know, we lived without PowerPoint for tens of thousands of years. So I was going to be cranky if I got stuck on that slide. All right, thanks. Following the election result, it took a few days, not just for myself, but for many of us to regroup. I went back to a very short list. I had a long list. It's a short list of Wiradjuri values to gather my strength. And this list, I know this list does not just represent my close Wiradjuri family, and the people that I study with in Wagga, a beautiful family. I know that most of you probably live these values as well. And what we need to remember, and why I believe many of us are here today, is that at the core of why we believe in the reconciliation movement is our shared sense of humanity. And our need as human beings to know we are behaving the best we can and doing what we can as human beings, as citizens of Australia and as citizens in a global village. I use the word Yindamurra daily. Senior people at the UQ, when they message me, they sign off Yindamurra, or they'll say, "You're a Dumarung, Anita." No, that means a lot to me, because language demonstrates the complexity of who we are, and we need to reclaim that. Okay. The work that has been generated by the reconciliation process is both mentally and emotionally exhausting. We are, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, expected to have an opinion on every issue, an answer to every question, and to engage in every conversation and argument that we are invited to at all times. We never clock off, unless we make a determined effort to do so. When I was writing this paper, I recalled watching a documentary about reconciliation with my classes at Macquarie University back in 2005 and 2006, when I was teaching in the Department of Indigenous Studies. It's called Whiteys Like Us by Rachel Landers and Tom Zabricki. In it, an Aboriginal Heritage Officer, Dave Watts, speaks with a reconciliation circle. Has anybody seen that by chance? Yeah. It's a group of white fellas on the northern beaches of Sydney. Now, Dave is specifically knowledgeable in the area of sites and heritage protection in the North Sydney region. But the first question thrown at him is about why Aboriginal people die so young. I felt Dave's exhaustion when that question was asked. The struggle to be the font of all Aboriginal knowledge for white fellas, to be that walking, talking Aboriginal encyclopedia who has to attempt to answer questions that your learning might not have provided you with, and to answer complex questions on the spot without time to fully consider. Do you think any, for example, white criminal lawyer invited to speak in an event would be expected to talk about literacy or nutrition? I don't think so. In my experience, white fellas do not expect themselves to have the same level, or anywhere near the same level, of knowledge of their own 200 plus year history or their own current social issues that they expect Aboriginal people to have of over 50,000 years. Nor do I believe that many white fellas recognise that issues that they classify as Aboriginal, such as life expectancy rates, the Aboriginal youth suicide crisis, incarceration rates and treatment of Indigenous youth in detention, black deaths in custody, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and the list goes on. These are not our issues. These are Australian issues that need to be understood, and Australians need to take responsibility and work towards finding solutions. These are issues that we all must demand our government act upon. To be blunt, in case it wasn't blunt enough, sorry, and I know I'm preaching to the converted, but the heavy lifting of reconciliation is meant to be done by non-Indigenous people. But I can tell you that by and large it's done by us. We are hand-holding, we are spoon-feeding people who insist that they need to take baby steps. And if I hear one more 50-year-old say to me, "Oh, but I didn't learn it at school." We have the internet now. We have theatre, literature, films, galleries. Courses. There is no excuse for people to say now that they didn't know or they don't know. And honestly, if you can Google an Aboriginal person like myself and find me to email me your question, you can probably Google to find your answer as well. Honestly, people are lazy. I have to tell my mother when people ring her, don't give them my email address. I'm probably just going to Google it anyway. People have to do some work. Now, when I wrote this, I had a particular group of people in mind. Clearly, it wasn't you, Mob. I'm sure they're not in the room. But maybe some of what I say today will help you in your conversations later. Yeah, you know, sometimes we hear a snippet and go, right, that clarifies something for me. Because we all have people in our lives somewhere, in our workplaces, in our friendship groups, and unfortunately even our families, that we need to have conversations with. Let's face it, we aren't here today because everybody thinks like us. If everyone thought like us, we wouldn't need Reconciliation Week because the work would be done. It's not, and we have a long way to go. We need to work together to get more people into this process to get the change we hope and desire. Not just for us as blackfellas, but for all Australians. Because I know that non-Indigenous people ache for change as well. And we saw it on the stage today. I'm a bit immune to white people crying because I see it. I know there's grief. White people grieve like we grieve. White people feel ashamed. I understand that. We feel the same things. And so I wanted to acknowledge people who came along today because I think you are. Non-Indigenous supporters are our goodwill soldiers. But we need to build our army. And so, with that in mind, I thought rather than taking questions today, I would do a call to action. We need to